In today's session, we're going to look a little bit at the Zoom F8 and how to get it set up. We're just going to have time to look at the fundamentals, the most critical settings, but obviously this product is way deeper than we can totally cover here. So let me just show you a few things. I think what we want to do is we first really want to come into, we're going to skip the Finder and metadata, and we're going to go straight to the input menu. There are a couple of things here that are of interest. First of all is the HPF. That's a high pass filter. If you're not sure what that is and whether or not you need one, I would just go ahead and leave it off. You can always apply a high pass filter in post. And in the Zoom F8, this is a digital high pass filter. So what that means in practical terms is the audio comes into the analog input, it's then converted to digital, and then a high pass filter is applied. If you're not sure what a high pass filter is, I'd encourage you to go back. We had a previous session where we talked about that. If you just go to our YouTube channel or the Google Plus page, you can see that. So here's where you would turn that on, and you can just turn it on input by input, and you can choose the frequency at which you want the high pass filter to kick in. So I would normally, if I was going to use it, set it around 80 hertz, unless I was getting a lot of low frequency noise that I wanted to cut out, might pull it up a little bit. So normally go ahead and leave that off. Okay, next is the input limiter. We have also done a previous piece where we talked about the limiters on the Zoom F8. They are digital limiters, and that is just like I talked about with the high pass filter. The audio comes in to the preamplifier, it's then converted to digital, and then the limiter does its job. So that's actually not as helpful as on a lot of the Pro gear, where on the Pro gear, all of the input limiter and the high pass filter are implemented in the analog stage so that you can kind of capture those issues before they get converted to digital and you experience any sort of clipping or distortion. So in the case of the Zoom F8, it's not as useful, but if you did want to turn it on, this is where you would do that. And again, you can do it input by input, so channel by channel or microphone by microphone. And first of all, you can turn it on. And then I would typically use a soft knee. I'd set the threshold somewhere about, maybe -10 to -6 dB full scale, just like that. And the defaults I would go with 1 millisecond attack time, 250 millisecond release time. Again, I don't normally turn those on this because, again, they're not going to capture cases where your talents suddenly modulate or get really loud. And unfortunately, they don't help a lot at that. However, on the bright side, the Zoom F8's preamplifiers have a lot of dynamic range. And so as long as you've set up your gain so that your peaks are under control, so normally when a person's talking, I would want to aim for maybe -18 to -12 dB. And that way you leave yourself plenty of headroom, so when they do get louder, it's not going to distort. All right, next is phase invert. If you don't know what this is, I would turn it off. Don't use it. But this is for solving particular problems, especially when you're recording with two separate microphones. Say, for example, a lavalier microphone and a boom microphone. And what can happen sometimes is if the two microphones are different distances from the sound source or the person speaking, you can start to get constructive or destructive interference between the two mics just because their waveforms happen to be out of phase from each other. And this would be a case where you could actually invert the phase to solve that problem. Again, not critical to use that all the time. Next is phantom power. You can turn on the phantom power. First of all, you can set the voltage, whether that be 48 volt or 24 volt. Typically, most modern mics are going to use 48 volt phantom power. So check your microphone's manual to make sure what you need. There is also this new setting called power saving for all inputs. This is only in the 2.1 firmware. And I think what this does is that when you go into the menu or you go to play back a track, it would actually turn the phantom power off for a microphone. And this is actually a way to bypass that. So if you set this to off, it won't remove the phantom power when you're doing playback. If you set it to on, it will actually turn off the phantom power for every microphone channel when you do playback. It's just trying to save on batteries a little bit. That can muddle with some microphones. Some microphones are a little bit more sensitive to how long they've been phantom powered. So if you just apply phantom power and start recording right away, things can get a little wonky. So that's what you can do here. And you can also, again, turn on phantom power channel by channel. This is not the only place you can do that. You can also do it when you come in. If I go back out of the menus here, if I press the PFL button for the channel that I'm going to work on here, say channel 1, you can see that I've got a lot of these settings right here. So phantom power there, I can turn it on just for this channel right here if I wanted to. In this case, I'm using a dynamic mic, so I don't want to do that. Next item is plug-in power. Plug-in power is if you need to apply plug-in power. That's 3 to 5 volts, and that's used for some microphones, aside from, usually it's not XLR mics. And I did not have good luck applying that and using a 3.5 millimeter input mic, a lavalier microphone with a 1/4-inch adapter. That still didn't work for me, so I'm not exactly sure how this works exactly, but there it is if you need it. Next, we have plug-in power. Plug-in power is 3 to 5 volts, and that's used for some lavalier microphones, for example. If you're going to plug one of those in that require 3 to 5 volts, again, read your manual if you're not sure. Input delay. Input delay, it allows you to set a delay for each of the individual inputs or channels. And what this is useful for is that, especially when you're using digital wireless lavalier microphones and other digital wireless microphones, there is usually some amount of latency. That is to say, it takes a while for the sound to be captured by the microphone. That part actually is pretty close to instant. But then when it takes it into the transmitter, it actually converts it from analog to digital. It usually encrypts it depending on the system that you're using. It then sends it wirelessly. It has to decrypt it, convert it back to analog. And during that process, there is some delay. So what this allows you to do is delay some of your non-digital wireless mics so that they'll all be in sync with one another. So again, kind of an advanced thing, not something you necessarily will need to use a lot, but if you do need it, it's there. So it's nice that they included it. Stereo link mode. You can choose various types of stereo links. You can do a stereo link or you can do a mid-side stereo link. I would say, unless you know what you're doing on stereo recording or mid-side recording, you probably just go ahead and leave these on stereo link, and only need to link them if you really need to do that. So next up is trim link. Trim link allows you to set the gain on one channel and have the gain be adjusted on a corresponding channel the same way that you've adjusted on that first channel. So this is useful, for example, if you have a couple of stereo mics set up and you want to be able to control the gain of both of them with a single potentiometer or single knob here. So that's what you would do in here. And you use this grid to set it up. So for example, if I wanted microphones 1 and say 4 to be controlled by the same one, I could do that right there, just like that. Now, if I need to clear this and go back to standard, which is no linking at all, I just click on clear and we're all set to go. All right, next up we have PFL mode. This is to define what happens when you press that PFL button for a channel. And I currently have them all set to PFL, which is pre-fader listen. What that means is that when I press the PFL button, the only thing I'm going to hear is that microphone, and I'm only going to hear it prior to any fader adjustments that I've made to it. So it's just going to apply the gain, and that's what I'm going to hear. If I set this instead to solo, it works a little differently. It actually will apply whatever fader adjustment you've made, and it will play just that channel as well. So typically I leave this on PFL, unless you have a reason where you specifically want to hear what the mic sounds like after the fader, then you would change that to solo. All right, that's it for the input menu. Let's go back up. Now let's come into the rec menu. This is one of the more important menus here in terms of critical settings. The first two settings, rec to SD1 and rec to SD2, let you define what you want to record to each of the SD memory cards. So you can actually have them record different things. And let's take a look at our options here. Track 1 through 8 polywave, what that does is that actually creates a single file, or in this case a wave file. And in that wave file, you'll have a separate channel for each of the individual tracks that you're recording. So that's a super helpful one, and one that I use quite often. The next one is track 1 through 8 mono stereo wave. So what this does is this actually records separate files for each input channel. So each microphone will have its own separate file, or if two inputs are set up as a stereo pair, that will create a single file with a left and right channel for the two microphones in that stereo pair. That's if you're, and again, all of these depend on your workflow and how you like to work. None of them are better than the others, so don't think of them in those terms, but think of them as tools for different jobs. Track 1 through 8 plus LR is, again, a poly wave file. In this case, what you get in the single wave file is individual channels for each of the 8 microphones if you're recording with all 8, or however many you are recording with, plus a stereo mixdown of all of the channels that you're recording. So that is actually a pretty common format that is used in professional productions. And typically what would happen is that the stereo pair would be the first 2 channels in the file, and then each of the individual isolated tracks would be the following channels in that file. So that is a very common one to use in professional productions. Next one is the same thing as before. It's tracks 1 through 8, each to their own individual files, unless they're set up as a stereo pair, in which case the 2 microphones in the stereo pair are saved to an individual file, a stereo file. And then also the mix down of all the tracks that you mixed on the recording is also saved to a separate stereo file, and it's all saved to WAV. The next one is just the stereo mixdown. So if you don't want to save any of the individual isolated tracks, you can just save the overall stereo mix that you did to a WAV file. And this last setting is the same thing, except to an MP3 file. So lots of different options there. In my case, I almost always use track 1 through 8 poly wave or track 1 through 8 LR poly wave. So I'm going to get a single file with all of the different channels in that single file. And in this one here, I'll also get a couple of additional channels that'll be the very first 2 that show up in the track or in the file that will be the stereo mixdown of everything. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there for now. You can do a different recording to SD card 2 if you want to. So that can be used as a backup or to record something different. So for example, here you might, for example, if you just want the stereo mix here, you could do that here and then have the isolated tracks saved to SD card 1. But whatever works for your particular case is what you need to do here. Next item up is sample rate. Now, sample rate for most video is typically 48 kilohertz. You can see there are lots of other options here. And some of these have to do with higher end productions, to be honest. So we have this 47.952 kilohertz. We also have this 48.048 kilohertz. I would typically stick with whatever is going to match your camera's footage. So in most cases, it's going to be 48 kilohertz. So I would typically leave it at that if you're not sure. Now, here is the bit depth, or what is sometimes referred to as word length. Your options here are 16 or 24-bit. I typically record to 24-bit. I know there's some controversy out there over whether 24-bit really gives you anything extra or improves your audio quality over 16-bit. And I would say this, my sense is, and this is just my subjective sense, that 24-bit gives you a little bit more to work with in post, and then your final export will typically be a 16-bit output. So, and that's fine. It's kind of like recording as much information as you can with your camera in terms of color information, and then when you export, you actually go to an H.264 file or something that you could upload to typical online websites or to YouTube or something like that. So I think it's better to capture those additional bits in the recording if you can. It makes it a little easier to post-process. So I usually leave that at 24. You can bump that down to 16 if you prefer. If you are going to record MP3s, you can change the bitrate of those as well. This is not the same as word length. This is something different, but you just get 3 different choices: 128 kilobits per second, 192, or 320. I would typically go 320. Again, audio takes so much less space than video, and memory cards are big enough now. It doesn't seem like it hurts from my point of view, to record pretty much the highest quality you can. I wouldn't necessarily bump up the sample rate, which will take a lot more data, but the bit rate I would go high and keep it there. Next item up is dual channel record. This is often called safety tracks in other devices here. So for example, input 1, we could say, let's turn that on. Now you can see that input 5 automatically turned on as well. So the way I would work this is that if I wanted to record channel 5 as a safety track, I would just set the gain level significantly lower than the primary channel. And that way, if I come back out here and we look at our meters, let's go through our meters a little bit here. Okay, check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see, you can see that tracks 1 and 3 are on. Check 1, 2, 3. You can see that one got really hot, but that one's recording much lower. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Check 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you can see that what's happening there is that track 5 is also recording the same thing I'm recording on channel 1 with just a single microphone input, but it's recording it at a much lower gain level, so you can use that as a safety track. So that's what that feature is all about. We're going to turn that off for now. Back into the rec menu, back into dual channel. I'm going to turn that off. Okay. Incidentally, you can see there's this all option down here. So you can do up to 4 safety tracks. If you record primary microphones on 1, 2, and 2, 3, 4, you can use 5, 6, 7, and 8 as the dual channel recording channels, or as safety tracks, if you will. You can also come into this all menu and just turn them all on or all off, just to make things a little easier and quicker. Next up is Prerecord. What this does is it's always going to be recording what's going on in terms of audio coming in through the microphones, and you can define how long before you actually press record that it will actually write to the file. So you have, here it's set to 6 seconds, you can see. Max file size has to do with how you have formatted your SD card. These days, I would almost always leave it at 2 gigabytes unless you have a reason not to. And that does it for the rec menu. Now, if you need to format your card, the SD card menu is where you want to go. Just come in here, choose format. In this case, I only have one SD card in right now, but I press that and it asks me if I'm sure I want to format it, and I will say yes, and it goes ahead and does that. Takes it just a second or two. You can also do a performance test to test if you have an SD card and you're not sure whether, or you suspect it may not be working right with the Zoom F8. You can actually have it test here. The full test takes quite some time, so you need to be, you need to have a lot of patience for that. That can take, depending on the size of the card, it can take 20 minutes, maybe even longer. A quick test is probably more likely what you'll want to do. And it will just it'll sort of evaluate the card and make sure that it's going to work well enough for the Zoom F8 here. The Zoom F8 is somewhat sensitive to the speed of the card, so if you're using an older card or a slower speed card, it can give you some trouble. So you want to make sure you test that up front. You can also get the information on the card. It'll tell you how much, how large it is, how much free space you have remaining, and how much time that corresponds to with the current setting. So here I could record 30 hours and 42 minutes. That's going to be quite a while. All right. Next up, USB. You can set this up to work as an audio interface or as a card reader when you hook it up via USB. One question I've had a lot on the Zoom F8, can you power the Zoom F8 by plugging in a USB cable and connecting it, say, for example, to one of those portable USB battery packs? The answer is unfortunately no. The Zoom F8's power requirements are quite a bit higher than a lot of the handy recorders. And so the handy recorders can do that, but Zoom F8 requires more power. I think that's part of its design, and I think it's part of how they were able to get very clean preamps. So it does require a little bit more power, and so you cannot use the USB card or USB input for powering it, but you can use it as a card reader or even as an audio interface to your computer. All right. The system menu is also pretty important for a lot of things here. Here's where you can set the date and time. You can choose how you want it to run through the power sources. So for right now, for example, I do not have it plugged into DC power. That's the AC to DC adapter that comes with it. I also have this external DC power, so I'm powering it right now via a large Anton Bauer battery. And it can give you, see it gives you some of the information about it. You can also choose the... it also just tells you where you're at in terms of different things. You can change the shutdown volume, you can change the shutdown voltage. And that's essentially the way it works, is that it can detect the voltage that's coming in through the batteries. And what it can do is you can tell it when to actually save the files and then shut down, so that when the battery gets to a certain level, it can manage that. Battery type, there's also nickel metal hydride or lithium you can choose from, or alkaline. I'm typically using rechargeable nickel metal hydrides, so that's where I leave it set. But you'll want to match that. What that's important for is that helps gauge the battery meter, so you know exactly how much you have left, because those 3 types of battery technologies work a little bit differently. So there's that. You can tell it to auto power off. if it's not been used for a certain period of time. I usually do not enable that feature. You can tell it whether to display the time code as large or small numbers. You can see here, for example, if we change it to small and we go back out, you can see now the time code is this smaller one here, whereas before it actually was showing the time code here and the current recording time here. So watch if I come back in, system, time code, big. You can see now the time code is the big display and the smaller one will be how long the current track has been recording. Level meters. You can choose the different types of level meters you want. You may want peak plus VU. You may want VU only. Peak is most useful to me, I think, because peak actually shows you where your peaks are going. And with digital recording, especially when you do not have any sort of limiter, having the peak view is very important. So I would choose peak only or peak plus VU. VU gives you kind of a better sense for the overall loudness, but it doesn't necessarily, if you did VU only, I don't know if that's as useful because you're going to miss your peaks potentially, and you got to watch those when you're doing digital recordings, as mentioned. You can tell it how long to hold a peak, so that's actually really helpful to be able to tell where your peaks are actually hitting, because if it's just real time, the peaks don't stay there long for the transients, and so having that kind of stay at the peak for a period of time, in this case 3 seconds, that helps you visualize a little better where your peaks are hitting. You can choose it for longer if you want to, up to infinity if you wanted to. I find 3 seconds works pretty well there. The resolution on the meters, you can have it solid or segmented. I usually just leave it at segmented, but solid you can see here looks a little different if we come back out. Check 1, 2, 3. Oh, I don't have the... Now that is enabled. You can see now it's just a solid line, as opposed to before when it was actually broken into individual segments. So just a preference thing there, however you want to do that. LED brightness, you can change the brightness of the LED. It's going to be hard to tell here simply because I have a light shining on it. But you can change that to suit your needs. Some other things here, there is an outdoor mode, which is pretty interesting. So if you're shooting outdoors and it's bright sunlight, you might want this kind of higher contrast view. Makes it a little bit easier to see outdoors. So that's an option there. You can go into a power saving mode as well. And again, you can change the brightness if you need to do that. All right, those are the main things that I wanted to cover for today's session. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And perhaps in a future episode, if we're finding there's enough demand out there amongst the audience, we can dig into some of the other menus as well. But there is kind of the basic setup for the Zoom F8.